I think the minivan is about to make a little bit of a comeback here in America. It's a pretty bold prediction, and welcome back to All Cars Y'all. I am John. Now, I am not proposing that we are going to go back to those heady days of the 90s and the early 2000s when minivanus familius domesticus roamed the strip mall parking lot seemingly in packs, but I am saying I think we're going to start to see the minivan come back with some changes. And I think there's about 4 pretty good data points that emphasize this. So again, I don't think we're going to go back to them being 5, 7, 10% of the market, but I do see the number of minivans actually increasing. And the first thing is changing demographics. Now, this one's pretty interesting, and this is my theory, but things in the automotive world, I think, tend to move in about 20-year cycles. So when we consider the minivan, if you look at those kids who 60s and 70s into the early 80s, where we grew up in our family's station wagons, these full-size station wagons like the Caprice, or in my case, an Oldsmobile Custom Cruiser. There's a great quote in the automotive world, which is, parents don't want to drive what their parents drove. And so when you think about the 80s, when the modern minivan came out, it exploded in popularity, and all other manufacturers tried to come into the market with something to compete with what Chrysler had. Now, do not lecture me. I know the Scout Scarab could have been considered the first minivan, or the VW Bus, but really it was the Chrysler products that set the template for the modern minivan, and they had a lot of strengths. A unibody construction, at least in the Chrysler case, great space inside, more efficient engine, more efficient space use because of transaxles. It was a really, really good product, and just so much better than any of the other opportunities, the other options that were out there. Well, once you get to the 2000s, the SUV and the CUV craze really started to kick into high gear, and you saw the peak of minivans, and then it decreased, big decrease right around 2008, 2009 during the downturn. But then it leveled and started to kind of go back up again, and SUVs have been ruling ever since. Now, I don't think that anything's really on the horizon to replace the SUV. It offers a lot of things that people love. You can get a lot of space, a lot of power. People like sitting up higher, and if they're not safer, they at least feel safer. But there's no arguing they are less space efficient and less fuel efficient than a minivan. And so I do see this generation of people who grew up in SUVs wanting something different, and with an increased awareness in our society of the environment and fuel efficiency, I do see families starting to look more towards, well, more cost-effective options and more fuel-efficient options, and that leads you to, naturally, to the minivans. And that brings us to number 2, which is all kind of backed up by sales have started increasing. Now, they do go up and down a little bit, of course, and we're talking about a pretty small percentage of the market. It's interesting to me that, let me check my notes here, the peak year for minivan sales was in 2000, 1.3 million, more than 1.3 million, and they sold more than 1 million minivans, not just Chrysler, all brands, from 93 to 05. Okay, that peak was only 7.2% of the market, which is really kind of surprising. Now, in 2022, minivan's share of the market increased to 2.1%. Now, that's up from 1.9%, but it's a modest increase, and that 0.1% came from SUVs. Now, when you're talking about points of a percent, you can be talking about literally rounding errors in many cases, or supply chain issues. But there's a couple of other factors in here, such as number 3, which is new entries in the market. Now, of course, manufacturers such as Ford, General Motors and all their divisions, VW, they've all left the market. And so we went from a peak of, unbelievably, 18 different specs for minivans down to about 4 or 5 right now. Of course, you've got the Toyota, you've got the Honda, you've got technically two different Chryslers, the Pacifica and the plug-in hybrid Pacifica. And then, of course, Kia and Hyundai had their own minivans. Hyundai dropped theirs, and the Sedona was never a really good seller, but they brought it back in around 2000, 2001 as the Carnival. And so the market's not dead, and you would expect Kia to leave, but they brought it back, and it's been a modest seller. And in fact, when you look at the sales data through like the first half of this year, sales are increasing. Again, up and down a little bit, but sales are increasing, and they're increasing rather strongly, outpacing the growth of the market. And that's that Kia. I want to point out here, this is where I think some of the challenge for minivans is going to be, is number 4 is finding new markets in the existing market. We've been through a long period of minivans constricting down to just a few options, but I think that's left a lot of room, and if consumers are going to start thinking, I want something more efficient and cheaper than an SUV, I think they're going to start looking at minivans again. But I think minivans have to change for the moment. So when I talk about new products, consider Volvo is talking about a new minivan, their first minivan entry. That's going to be all EV, 500 horsepower, 500 miles of range. But right now they're saying it's only for China, and that 500 miles is the Chinese cycle, not our EPA cycle. But it's a tantalizing prospect. And so one of the places I think they can move to is certainly electric minivans. I know not everyone is a fan of electric at the moment, but it's there, and it's a hot thing that everybody's talking about, and Volvo's got one sitting out there. The other thing is I could really see that while the current minivans have a lot of luxury features, leather and multi-zone air conditioning and rear DVD and everything else, in China, they actually have luxury minivans. Toyota has one, and notably Buick has one as well. I think that's an untapped market up above, which also plays into executive rideshare like Uber's Uber Black, if you could have a very high-end luxury limo-like experience in a minivan, as well as autonomous vehicles. Now, while products like Cruise by GM are using small little vehicles, others are basing theirs on minivans, and you'll see Chrysler Pacificas running around, I believe, in Phoenix, as a matter of fact. I think that's a largely untapped market. I think you could see autonomous vehicles as they roll out. It's not here yet, but as it comes, a large market for minivans in cities around the world in the United States using minivans just for their space efficiency and to hold, you know, all your luggage when you're on your way to the airport or whatever it happens to be. But that also leaves us with multiple minivans. China is huge for minivans. They're out there. They could be ported over here to America. But I want to draw attention that while minivans are a more affordable option, depending on what you're looking at. I actually spot checked earlier, and the base price for a Honda Odyssey, base price, $37,840. To my surprise, the Honda Pilot is slightly cheaper at $37,090, so about $800 cheaper. But if you compare with a Suburban at $57,200, it's nearly $20,000 less expensive. And so as we have a market where the price is approaching $50,000 on average, people are craving a less expensive option. In fact, look at GM. They canceled the Trax and then brought it back like a year later or 18 months later, whatever it was, because people reached out. I think their dealers were screaming for a more affordable option to sell now that all the cars have dried up. And I think that leaves another opportunity for minivan makers, is that modern minivans are so nice and so well equipped. I do think there's an option down there, not for the cargo van, not for what Ford tried to do with their Transit, making it, they actually called it the unminivan, but a more basic option, like the old Caravans. They had a really basic option, and then you had the Grand Caravan. I'm not sure we're going to go back to short wheelbase ones, but I could see a entry-level minivan really filling the needs of a lot of people who can't afford a $40,000 or $50,000 minivan, but they need to move the kids, they need to move all the sports gear and everything else. And I think the data shows it's slightly increasing in sales. I think that as we continue to pour investments into sport utilities, more expensive sport utilities, and certainly as you see manufacturers say, oh, look, our cheapest one is $40,000, but we really want you to buy this $80,000 one. I think there's going to be continued pushback, more and more of people wanting to go into something that's more space efficient, more fuel efficient, and cheaper. In addition to what I talked about, the autonomous driving and even luxury up-level minivans. I can see a world where these Buicks, Volvos, based on a Geely actually, minivans come to America. And I think if Buick did or if Volvo did, I think they would largely have the market to themselves. If the power, the price, and the ride and handling, and the quality of the materials, if everything is right, I think there's a slice above what Toyota and Honda and Kia are offering that is ripe for the taking, and I think there's a slice below it as well. I'm not saying that we're going to go back to, again, 5 or 7% of the market where you see 1 out of every 15 cars sold as a minivan, and we've got 15 different options. But I can see a couple of players moving in and untapping some market where this 2% rises up to 3, something like that. It's a smart decision, and I will end with nobody ever wants a minivan. A minivan is not a lifestyle vehicle. That's why people buy SUVs. A minivan says, here's where I'm stuck in my life. I've got the kids. I've got to get them to sports. I've got to drop them off. It doesn't scream, I'm cool. But it has so many strengths. And when I look at that new Kia Carnival, although I don't like the name, to me, they've butched it up a little bit. There's some hints of SUV in there. And we see that with some of our newer SUVs like that Chevy Trax. It's really a tall hatchback more than an SUV. And I think we might start to see that a little bit with the minivans. If they give them some SUV touches, it might be able to overcome some of the resistance people have of driving, the mom-mobile. Let me know what you think below, guys. Thanks for being here.